No World Cup team had ever done this before. A national team, qualified through a full cycle of competitive football, arrived at the tournament and could not stay overnight in the host country, not because of injury or logistics or a preference for familiar surroundings, because the government of the host country had declined to allow it. After every match, the players returned to another country. They crossed an international border. They slept. They trained. They crossed back. They played. And then they crossed again. This is not a hypothetical scenario constructed to illustrate a point about geopolitics and sport. This is what appeared to happen during the 2026 FIFA World Cup, when the Islamic Republic of Iran, a nation that qualified for its 7th World Cup appearance, whose players competed in European leagues, whose fans filled stadiums across the world, based its squad not in the United States, but in Tijuana, Mexico, directly across the border from San Diego, and crossed into American territory for each of its group stage matches. That sentence, in whatever language it is read, carries within it the full weight of what the 2026 World Cup represented for one of the 48 nations invited to participate in it, and the story of how Iran arrived at that arrangement, the months of negotiation, the ultimatums, the rejected requests, the brokered compromise involving a sitting head of state, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the tournament. Iran qualified for the 2026 World Cup in March 2025. It was their 7th appearance at the tournament, their 4th in a row. Mehdi Taremi scored the goals that sent them through. The process was ordinary in the way that World Cup qualification, for a nation of Iran's footballing tradition, had become almost routine. What followed was not routine. On February 28th of the following year, conflict began. Iran's sports minister appeared on state television and made a statement that reverberated through the football world. He said that under no circumstances could Iran participate in the World Cup. Not a qualified statement. Not a "we are reviewing the situation." Under no circumstances. FIFA's response came from the top, immediately and repeatedly. The president of the governing body said clearly, in public, on multiple occasions, that Iran would participate. He said it at the FIFA Congress in Vancouver in late April, opening his remarks by stating he was confirming straight away that Iran would of course be participating. He said it like a man who had been fighting that specific battle for 2 months and had grown tired of having to fight it in public as well as in private. The tension between those two positions, a government saying under no circumstances and FIFA saying of course Iran will be participating, created a months-long negotiation that drew in players, federation officials, government representatives, and ultimately the president of Mexico. Iran's Football Federation responded to the situation with a document, a 10-point ultimatum that laid out the conditions under which Iranian participation could be considered possible. The demands were specific and revealing. They asked for guaranteed visas for every player and every member of the traveling party. They specifically named Mehdi Taremi and Captain HSA Insafi, whose mandatory military service histories created complications under United States immigration classification. They demanded that Iran's anthem be played correctly at each match. They demanded that the Iranian flag be respected. They demanded that the delegation be protected at airports, at hotels, and on the roads between venues, and they asked FIFA to move their group stage matches from the United States to Mexico. FIFA said no to the match relocation. The fixtures would remain where they were scheduled, but the base camp question remained open for weeks. Iran's originally approved base camp in Tucson, Arizona, became the subject of extended discussions. The answer that eventually emerged appeared to be that the Iranian squad could not be permitted to stay overnight on American territory. The solution, brokered in the weeks before the tournament began, involved 3 parties: the Iranian Football Federation, FIFA, and the government of Mexico, specifically President Claudia Sheinbaum, whose government agreed to host the Iranian squad for the duration of the group stage. Iran would base themselves in Tijuana, Mexico. Tijuana sits directly across the border from San Diego, a crossing that in normal circumstances takes minutes, that tens of thousands of people make every day. That is one of the busiest land border crossings in the world. For Iran's national football team, it became the route to and from every match on match days. The squad crossed into the United States. They traveled to the venue. They played. After the final whistle, they returned. For the Seattle fixture, the furthest match from their base, the crossing added an international flight, Tijuana to Seattle and back, a journey that for any other participating nation would have been a domestic flight. For Iran, it was an international journey. crossing a border each time. With all the documentation and clearance requirements that international travel involves, FIFA's president watched Iran's warm-up match against Costa Rica, a 5-0 victory in Antalya, Turkey, while there for bilateral meetings with the federation. He stayed to watch the game. That detail told its own story about the level at which this relationship was being managed. Mehdi Taremi was 32 years old. He played for Inter Milan. He had been the goals that sent Iran to the World Cup. His name appeared specifically in Iran's 10-point ultimatum as one of the players whose visa situation created concerns requiring explicit guarantees. The reasons connected to mandatory military service classifications under United States immigration law were not of his making. They were a function of his nationality and the legal frameworks that applied to him by virtue of where he was born. Captain HSA Insafi found himself in a similar position, a player whose captaincy represented the culmination of years of professional development, suddenly required to be named specifically in a formal document as evidence that his ability to enter the host country could not be taken for granted. These are not abstractions. These are footballers, men who had trained their entire careers for the opportunity to play at a World Cup, whose access to that opportunity depended not on their footballing ability, which was not in question, but on the ability of lawyers and diplomats to navigate a landscape that had nothing to do with football. Iran's group matches in Los Angeles had more unsold tickets than almost any other team in the competition. Iranian fans who might have traveled who had, in previous tournaments, created some of the most vivid atmospheres in World Cup group stages were largely absent. Not because they chose not to come, because coming was not straightforwardly possible. Mexico's decision to host Iran's squad was not a neutral logistical choice. It was a political act by a government that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to do it anyway. President Sheinbaum's involvement spoke to something beyond football administration. Mexico is one of 3 host nations for this World Cup. The decision to offer Tijuana as Iran's base to make it possible for a squad the United States would not host overnight to participate in a tournament hosted partly on Mexican soil was Mexico acting within its own sovereign authority to fill a gap that the primary governing body of the tournament had left. The irony of a World Cup in which Mexico City's Azteca Stadium hosted the opening ceremony while simultaneously Mexico was hosting the sleeping quarters of a team that couldn't sleep in the host country next door is an irony that belongs to 2026 as surely as any goal or result. The story of Iran at the 2026 World Cup was still unfolding in the tournament's opening days. What was already part of the record was the fact of the Tijuana base camp, the border crossings, the 10-point ultimatum, and the involvement of a sitting head of state to make possible something that should, for a qualified World Cup participant, have been straightforward. The question this story raises is not about Iran specifically. It is about what a World Cup is supposed to be, and who it is supposed to be for. What universal welcome means when it requires a team to cross an international border before every match. The gap between the language of inclusivity and the operational reality of what inclusivity requires, and it is about the players who carried all of this with them onto the pitch in Los Angeles and Seattle and played football anyway. Because whatever happened in the corridors of federation offices and government ministries and airport immigration halls, on the pitch, the game was the same game it always was. Hard, beautiful, uncertain, and worth every border crossing to play. What do you think? Does the Tijuana arrangement feel like a solution or like an exposure of a problem that should never have existed? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe for full coverage through every story this tournament produces. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It is a moment in time. And what Iran went through to be at this one will be studied for as long as the sport keeps records of how its greatest tournament was organized, and for whom.